What if the Rome you learned about was never really Rome at all? What if the marble and the monuments, the triumphal arches and the gleaming temples were simply the city's carefully arranged face, turned outward toward history, while behind it, just a few streets away, thousands of people were doing work so dangerous, so exhausting, so relentlessly perilous, that most of them never made it into a single inscription or a single text. The generals got the statues, the emperors got the marble, and the man who spent his days descending into a Roman sewer or hauling stone through a collapsing mine or standing in an arena with nothing between him and something that wanted to eat him got a shallow grave and a forgotten name. Tonight, we open those files. We walk away from the forum, away from the triumphal processions and the gleaming porticos, and we follow the narrow streets down into the parts of Rome that history tried to quietly bury. We are going to spend some time with the people who kept the empire running through sheer, unacknowledged endurance. The ones who worked the jobs that nobody wanted, in the places nobody visited, doing the things that made civilization possible, while civilization pretended not to notice them. And we are going to do it slowly, quietly, the way you read a document that was never meant to be found. Before we go further, if you enjoy stories where history refuses to make sense, where the official record keeps leaving out the most interesting parts, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are listening in the dark somewhere right now, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I want to imagine this silence stretching across the world, all of us gathered in the night around the same forgotten archive, reading the same hidden files together. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already, let the day fall away, and let's ease into this together. To understand why certain Roman jobs were so extraordinarily dangerous, you first have to understand the city itself. Not the version on the brochure, not the Rome of gleaming marble and philosophical senators, the real Rome, the one that smelled and groaned and pressed in on itself from every direction. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Rome may have held close to 1 million people within its boundaries, perhaps more. That number is almost impossible to fully absorb when you consider that this was a city without electricity, without modern construction materials, without organized emergency services in any meaningful sense, and without the kind of urban planning that might have made 1 million people living in close proximity even remotely manageable. Rome had not been designed for what it became. It had grown organically and chaotically over centuries, accumulating neighborhoods and alleyways and districts the way a river accumulates debris, piling up wherever the current slowed. Most Romans did not live in the elegant houses you might imagine. They lived in apartment buildings called insulae, a Latin word that means islands, which is poetically accurate because each building was essentially its own isolated world, surrounded by narrow streets that functioned more like channels between tall, leaning structures than anything you would comfortably call a road. These buildings rose several stories into the Roman sky. 4 floors, 5 floors, sometimes 6 or more in the periods before emperors began issuing height restrictions, which they had to do more than once because landlords kept ignoring them. The economics of the insula were simple and brutal. The lower floors were sturdier, better built, better ventilated, closer to the street, and therefore more expensive. The higher you climbed, the cheaper the rent became, and the more precarious your existence. Upper floors were often built with lighter materials, wood where there should have been stone, thin walls where there should have been thickness, foundations that had been pushed beyond their original design by the addition of yet another floor that the landlord decided to add without consulting any laws of physics or building codes, because Rome did not really have building codes in the modern sense, and the ones it did have were inconsistently enforced at best. Fires were constant. Oil lamps, open cooking fires, wooden beams, crowded rooms with poor ventilation. These were the ingredients of catastrophe, and catastrophe arrived regularly. When a fire started in an insula, it moved fast. The buildings were close together, sometimes sharing walls, sometimes nearly touching across alleys so narrow that a person could reach from one window to the building opposite. If you lived on the upper floors, escape routes were limited. You could try the stairs if they were not already burning. You could try the window, which meant a fall that increased in lethality with every floor you were above the ground. Or you could wait and hope someone noticed in time. Structural collapses were less common than fires, but not rare. Ancient writers describe buildings that simply gave way, entire floors pancaking downward because the foundation had been inadequate from the beginning, or because a landlord had added weight the structure was never designed to bear. The poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century, captured the anxiety of Roman apartment living with characteristic sharpness. He described the experience of living in a building that creaks and shifts and makes sounds in the night that no building should make, and suggested that anyone who could afford to leave Rome for a quieter life in the countryside would be wise to do so immediately. Most people could not afford to leave. Most people stayed, and most people who stayed needed to work. Which brings us to the work itself. Let's begin underground. Beneath the streets of Rome, beneath the insulae and the markets and the temples and the forums, there ran a network of tunnels and channels that made the city function. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, was one of the oldest pieces of infrastructure in Rome, dating back in some form to the 6th century before the Common Era. It had been built to drain the marshland between the hills where Rome would eventually grow, and it had been expanded and modified and extended over centuries until it formed the spine of a vast underground drainage system that carried waste and water out to the Tiber. Without it, Rome would have flooded, would have drowned in its own refuse, would have become uninhabitable within a generation. Someone had to maintain it. The men who worked the sewers of Rome occupied a position in the social hierarchy that was difficult to describe precisely because it existed so far below the categories that Roman society usually bothered to record. They were not slaves in many cases, though some certainly were. They were not free citizens in any meaningful sense of the word, though technically some may have held that status. They were the people who did the work that made everything else possible, in conditions that most Romans preferred not to think about. Picture what it meant to descend into the Cloaca Maxima. The tunnels were large by ancient standards, some sections tall enough to stand in, wide enough to move through with tools, which was necessary because the maintenance work required physical labor performed in the dark, in spaces that the rest of the city was actively filling with everything it wanted to forget. The smell was extraordinary in the worst possible sense. Roman cities produced enormous quantities of organic waste, and in the absence of modern plumbing systems, most of it eventually found its way into these channels. The men who worked down there breathed that air for hours at a time. But the smell was not the most dangerous thing. The gases were. In enclosed underground spaces where organic matter decomposes, certain gases accumulate. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide in concentrations that displace oxygen and suffocate without warning. A worker could be moving through a tunnel that seemed perfectly navigable, and then step into a pocket of accumulated gas and lose consciousness before he had time to understand what was happening. If he was alone, he did not come back up. If he was with colleagues who rushed to help, they sometimes joined him in the same invisible catastrophe. There were also the structural hazards. The tunnels were old, maintained imperfectly, subject to the same pressures of 1 million people living above them that affected everything else in the city. Sections could be narrow, forcing workers to crouch or crawl. Flooding could occur when rains overwhelmed the system's capacity, turning maintenance passages into death traps with no exit. And the biological hazards were not limited to gases. The waste itself carried disease, and the men who worked in it, who handled it, who breathed the air above it for hours every day, absorbed those diseases into their bodies. Life expectancy for this kind of work was not something that Roman record keepers bothered to track, but we can make reasonable inferences from what we know about the conditions. The Romans understood, in a vague way, that sewer work was unhealthy. There are references in ancient texts to the unpleasant nature of the work, to the men who did it as occupying a particular social category that combined necessity with disgust. The work had to be done. The people who did it were both essential and invisible. The city depended on them absolutely and preferred not to think about them at all. This is one of the recurring patterns you find when you dig into Roman labour history. The more essential the work, the more likely it was to be performed by people whose names never made it into the record. The more dangerous the conditions, the more completely history tends to look away. Let's look anyway. If this kind of hidden history speaks to you, it would mean a great deal if you like this video and subscribe to the archive. It helps more people find their way down these quiet, forgotten streets. Above the sewers, the city continued its relentless, hungry consumption of materials. Rome was always building, always expanding, always requiring more stone, more marble, more timber, more brick. The monuments you can still visit today, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the various forums and temples and baths, these were not conjured from nothing. They were extracted from the earth at enormous human cost, transported across distances that required coordinated labour on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend, and assembled by workers whose daily existence was defined by the proximity of death. The quarries were among the most dangerous workplaces in the ancient world. The marble quarries at Carrara in northern Italy, the limestone quarries throughout the Italian peninsula, the stone quarries in Egypt and across the provinces. These were places where thousands of men worked in conditions that combined physical extremity with almost no margin for error. Many of these workers were slaves. Some were condemned criminals, sentenced to the mines or quarries as a punishment that was understood to be a death sentence delivered slowly rather than quickly. Some were free labourers who had no other options. Quarry work in antiquity meant descending into open cuts in the earth that grew deeper and more unstable as extraction continued. It meant working with iron tools to break stone from faces that could shift and collapse without warning. Rockfalls were constant. A crack in the stone face above you could release tons of material in an instant, and the only warning might be a sound, a low groan from the rock, or no warning at all. Workers developed an intuitive sense for the behavior of stone, a knowledge accumulated through experience and passed down through whatever informal networks existed among people who worked these sites. But intuition and experience could not eliminate the fundamental danger of the work. The dust was also killing them, though they would not have understood it in those terms. Silica dust from cutting and breaking stone accumulates in the lungs over years of exposure, causing a progressive and irreversible scarring that eventually makes breathing impossible. A man who began working in a quarry at 15 might be functionally disabled by his late 30s, his lungs too damaged to support the physical demands of continued labor. This was not a condition that ancient medicine could diagnose or treat. It would simply have presented as a progressive weakness, a shortness of breath that worsened over time, until the work that had always been hard became impossible. And yet the quarries kept operating. The stone kept moving, the buildings kept rising, because Rome's appetite for construction was essentially insatiable, and the people who fed that appetite were, from the perspective of the system, replaceable. The mines were worse. Roman mining operations extended across the empire, from the silver mines of Spain to the gold mines of Dacia to the copper mines of Cyprus. These were not the carefully engineered underground operations of later centuries. They were, in many cases, tunnels and shafts driven into the earth by the most direct means available, following veins of ore wherever they led, without systematic planning or structural reinforcement beyond what was immediately necessary to keep the tunnel from collapsing on the workers inside it. The conditions in the Roman mines were described by ancient writers with a frankness that suggests the reality was too extreme to soften. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described the silver mines of Spain in terms that are almost unbearable to read. Workers, he wrote, laboured continuously in the underground passages, which were narrow and cramped, unable to stand upright, forced to work by lamplight in air that was thick with dust and the fumes of the ore processing that happened nearby. They were not permitted to rest. They worked until they could not work anymore, and when they could not work anymore, they were replaced. The lamplight detail is significant. Working by oil lamp in a confined underground space creates its own particular set of hazards. The lamps consume oxygen. In a poorly ventilated tunnel, the oxygen level drops as the lamp burns, and the workers breathing that same air begin to feel the effects: dizziness, confusion, weakness, before they necessarily understand what is happening. The lamp itself could also trigger fires in spaces where flammable gases had accumulated from the decomposition of organic material in the rock or from the ore processing chemicals used above ground. Heat was another constant enemy. The deeper you went into the earth, the hotter it became. Roman miners working at depth would have been operating in temperatures that made the physical labor exponentially more demanding. They sweated profusely. They lost fluids. In a system that had no organized way to provide adequate water to underground workers, dehydration was a persistent and serious threat, and the tunnels collapsed. Not occasionally, regularly. The Roman approach to mine engineering was, in many operations, essentially empirical. You drove the tunnel forward, you extracted the ore, and you hoped the ceiling held. When it did not hold, you lost the workers who were inside, and you began again somewhere else. The scale of Roman mining operations, the sheer volume of metal that the empire extracted over centuries, implies a corresponding scale of human loss that the historical record almost entirely fails to document. We know the empire ran on silver and gold. We know the aqueducts were built with lead. We know the legions were equipped with iron. What we rarely pause to consider is the human arithmetic that produced all of that metal. The lives that were spent in the dark so that the surface world could continue its business in the light. Let's come back up to the surface. Let's go to the place where Rome's appetite for spectacle met its appetite for danger and produced something that was, in its own terrible way, one of the most sophisticated industries the ancient world ever created: the arena. Most people know something about gladiators. The image is deeply embedded in popular culture. The armored fighter, the roaring crowd, the raised thumb or lowered thumb, the theatrical violence of it all. What popular culture tends to get somewhat wrong is the texture of the reality, the daily lived experience of the men who occupied this world, the economics of it, the training, the social position, the way it actually felt to be a professional fighter in an institution that was simultaneously one of the most dangerous jobs in Rome and, paradoxically, one of the few dangerous jobs that came with anything resembling structure and support. Gladiators trained in facilities called ludi, schools that were, in some ways, better organized than most Roman institutions serving the working poor. The ludus provided food, medical care of a kind, housing, and training. The gladiatorial schools of Rome employed physicians because the investment in a trained fighter was significant, and the owner of the school had a financial interest in keeping his fighters functional. There is archaeological evidence from sites like Ephesus, where a gladiatorial cemetery was excavated in the early 21st century, suggesting that gladiators received medical attention for wounds that, without treatment, would have been fatal. Healed fractures, evidence of surgical intervention. The bones tell a story of violence survived, which is its own kind of remarkable. But let's not romanticize this too far. The medical care existed because gladiators were expensive assets. The care was not provided out of concern for the individual human being. It was provided because a well-trained fighter represented a substantial investment, and losing that investment to an infected wound that could have been treated was simply bad economics. The gladiator was cared for the way a valuable piece of equipment is maintained, not the way a person is cherished. The mortality rates for gladiators are a subject of genuine scholarly debate. Earlier estimates suggested that gladiators died in the arena at very high rates, perhaps 50% of bouts ending in death. More recent analysis of the historical and archaeological evidence suggests a more nuanced picture. Death in the arena was not the automatic outcome of every defeat. The crowd, the sponsor of the games, and the editor, the official presiding over the event, all had roles in deciding whether a defeated fighter lived or died. A fighter who had performed well, who had shown courage and skill, even in defeat, might be granted mercy. There was a theatrical logic to the arena that did not always demand death as its conclusion. The actual mortality rates were probably lower than the popular image suggests, though still extraordinarily high by any modern standard. Some scholars estimate that a professional gladiator might fight 2 or 3 times a year, and that over a career of several years, the cumulative probability of death in the arena was substantial. Not certain at any single bout, but almost inevitable over time if the career continued long enough. And then there were the categories of arena work that did not come with even the limited protections of the gladiatorial system. The damnatiad bestias, the condemned to the beasts, occupied the lowest position in the arena hierarchy. These were criminals, prisoners of war, members of persecuted groups, people who had been sentenced by the Roman legal system to die in the arena as a form of public execution that doubled as entertainment. They received no training. They had no patron, no school, no physician waiting at the edge of the sand. They were placed in the arena with wild animals, lions, bears, leopards, bulls, rhinoceroses on special occasions, and they were expected to die. That was not a possibility. That was the sentence. The animal was the instrument of execution. The crowd was the audience for a punishment that the Roman state had decided should be witnessed. The people who managed the animals, who transported them, who fed them and kept them alive and healthy enough to perform their function in the arena. These workers occupied their own dangerous niche. Wild animals in captivity are not domesticated animals. A lion that has been transported in a cage from North Africa to Rome, that has been kept hungry to ensure its aggression in the arena, that is frightened and in pain and disoriented, is not a creature that can be safely managed. The men who worked with these animals did so with whatever tools and techniques they had developed through experience, and those techniques were sometimes sufficient and sometimes were not. The bestiarii, the fighters who specialized in combat with animals, were a distinct category from gladiators, sometimes trained separately, sometimes regarded as lower in the arena hierarchy. Their work was different in character from gladiatorial combat. You could not negotiate with a lion. You could not read its intentions from subtle shifts in posture the way you might read a human opponent. The animal operated on instinct, and instinct in a large predator is extraordinarily efficient. The bestiarius who survived was the one who had developed a particular combination of physical skill, psychological calm, and the kind of experiential knowledge that can only be accumulated by spending time with dangerous animals and surviving that time. Not everyone did. I wonder sometimes what patterns you have noticed in your own reading of history. If you have come across other ancient systems, Roman or otherwise, where the most essential workers were also the most completely erased from the record, leave that in the comments. The archive is always listening, and those connections matter more than you might think. But step back from the arena for a moment. Step back from the obvious dangers of the underground and the spectacular dangers of the sand, and consider something more mundane. Consider the people who built Rome's most ordinary infrastructure: the roads, the aqueducts, the bridges, the walls. Roman roads are one of the genuine engineering marvels of the ancient world. They were built to last, and many of them did last, in some form, for centuries beyond the fall of the empire that built them. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, still exists. You can walk on it today. The stone is still there, still roughly in the position it was placed 2,000 years ago, which is a testament to the quality of Roman road construction. What that quality required was labour. Enormous quantities of labour performed in conditions that varied from merely difficult to genuinely lethal, depending on the terrain, the season, and the particular stretch of road being built. Road construction required clearing the path, which in forested or mountainous terrain meant the kind of physical work that exhausted the body over days and weeks. It required digging the roadbed to the correct depth, which in hard ground meant hours of work with iron tools that were adequate but not efficient. It required laying the layers of foundation material, the rubble and gravel and sand that went beneath the surface stones, carrying and placing material by hand and by cart in quantities that are difficult to imagine. And it required cutting, transporting and placing the surface stones themselves. Large, heavy, precisely fitted pieces of rock that had to be moved from wherever they were quarried to wherever they were needed, often over distances that made the logistics of the operation a challenge in itself. The workers who built Roman roads were often soldiers, which is one of the aspects of Roman military service that tends to get overlooked in the more dramatic accounts of legionary combat. Roman soldiers spent a great deal of their service time not fighting, but building roads, fortifications, camps, bridges. The engineering capacity of the Roman legions was one of their most significant military advantages, but it was also a source of relentless physical labour for the men in the ranks. A legionary who signed up for the glory of military service and found himself digging a roadbed through rocky ground in the heat of a Spanish summer might have had complicated feelings about the transaction. Civilian labourers also worked on Roman construction projects in large numbers. Slaves, freed persons, free workers of the labouring class all contributed to the physical work of building the infrastructure that made the empire function. And for these workers, the hazards were the same as they are in any large-scale construction operation, multiplied by the absence of safety equipment, safety regulations, medical care for injuries, or any institutional acknowledgement that the worker's body had value beyond its immediate productive capacity. Falls from heights, crushing injuries from heavy stone, injuries from tools, heat exhaustion during summer work, hypothermia during winter work in the northern provinces, infections from wounds that went untreated, the cumulative physical damage of years of heavy labour on a body that was never given adequate rest or nutrition. The Roman construction worker did not leave behind memorials. The road is the memorial. The aqueduct is the memorial. The bridge is the memorial. The man who placed each stone, who carried each load, who dug each trench, is entirely absent from the record, present only in the aggregate of what he built. Now let's talk about fire. Rome burned. Not once, not occasionally, but regularly, persistently, almost as a feature of urban life rather than an interruption of it. The famous fire of 64 CE, the one associated with Nero, was the most dramatic and historically documented conflagration. But it was far from the only one. Ancient sources record fires in Rome with a frequency that suggests the city was in a more or less permanent state of low-level combustion, with occasional catastrophic escalations. The reasons were structural: dense wooden construction, open flames for cooking and heating and lighting, no organized fire suppression in the early periods of Roman history. Even when Augustus created the vigils, the night watchmen who served a firefighting function among other duties, the tools available to them were limited. Buckets of water, hooks to pull burning material away from structures. In some cases, the deliberate demolition of buildings to create fire breaks. These were the technologies available to fight fires in a city of 1 million people packed into wooden apartment buildings. The vigiles themselves occupied an interesting and somewhat ambiguous position in Roman society. They were not quite soldiers, not quite police, not quite firefighters in the modern sense, but something of all three. They patrolled at night. They were supposed to respond to fires. They also had law enforcement functions, particularly related to the regulation of nighttime activity in the city. Their social status was low. Many were freed slaves. The work was dangerous, physically demanding, and poorly compensated relative to the risks it involved. Fighting a fire in an ancient city meant approaching burning buildings without any of the protective equipment that modern firefighters take for granted. No breathing apparatus to filter the smoke that could incapacitate a person in minutes. No fire-resistant clothing to protect against the radiant heat of a major blaze. No understanding of fire behavior that would allow systematic, strategic suppression. The vigil who ran toward a burning insula was running toward a structure that might collapse at any moment, in air that was filling with smoke, with tools that were barely adequate to the task. And the smoke itself was particularly dangerous in Rome because of what was burning. Roman buildings contained lead, used in pipes and fittings and decorative elements. They contained various dyes and chemicals used in the textile workshops and other small industries that occupied the ground floors of insulae. They contained stored goods, food, oil, materials of all kinds. When these things burned, they produced smoke that was not simply hot and suffocating, but actively toxic in ways that the people breathing it could not have understood. The vigil who survived a career of firefighting in ancient Rome had survived something genuinely extraordinary. The ones who did not survive were simply absorbed into the general category of workers whose deaths were an expected cost of the work they did. Let's move to another kind of fire, the controlled kind, the kind that Rome needed to run. The bakers of Rome worked in conditions that were, in their own way, as physically demanding as anything we have discussed. Bread was the fundamental food of the Roman working class. The annona, the grain dole, distributed grain to hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens, but grain had to be processed into flour, and flour had to be baked into bread, and that baking happened in establishments that combined the hazards of heavy industrial work with the particular misery of sustained high heat. Roman bakeries, pistrina, were found throughout the city. They were not small domestic operations, but commercial enterprises producing bread in large quantities for urban populations. The work required grinding grain into flour using large millstones, typically turned by animals or, in some operations, by slaves working in rotation. The millstone work was grinding in both the literal and metaphorical sense. The physical effort of keeping a large millstone turning was enormous. The dust produced by the grinding process was a constant respiratory hazard. Workers who spent years in bakery grinding operations developed the same kind of lung damage that afflicted quarry workers, from the same basic cause: fine particulate matter inhaled over years of exposure. The baking itself required managing large, wood-fired ovens that reached temperatures necessary to bake bread quickly and in quantity. The workers who loaded and unloaded these ovens, who maintained the fires, who moved trays and loaves in and out of spaces that radiated intense heat, did so without any of the protective equipment that modern bakers in industrial settings use as a matter of course. Burns were routine. Heat exhaustion was a regular hazard during summer months when the ambient temperature of Rome combined with the heat of the ovens to create working conditions that were physiologically extreme. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii, which preserves Roman commercial life in extraordinary detail because of the particular nature of its destruction, shows us what Roman bakeries looked like. The millstones are still there. The ovens are still there. The counters where bread was displayed for sale are still there. What the archaeology cannot show us is the daily reality of the people who worked in those spaces, but we can infer it from the physical evidence of the environment itself. The people who worked in Roman bakeries were often slaves. The association between bakery work and slavery is well documented in ancient sources. This tells us something important about how Roman society valued this work, which is to say, it did not value it at all in terms of ocular recognition. The work was necessary. The people who did it were owned. The bread appeared on the counter each morning, and the city consumed it without particular thought about the process that produced it. There is a particular kind of historical invisibility that attaches to necessary, unglamorous work. The more a society depends on something, the more completely it tends to render invisible the people who provide it. Rome depended on its bread absolutely, and the people who made that bread are almost entirely absent from the historical record as individuals. What hidden history keeps you awake at night? What piece of the official record feels most incomplete to you, most deliberately smoothed over? Leave it in the comments. These are exactly the kinds of questions the archive was built around. Let's go to the river. The Tiber was Rome's lifeline in multiple senses. It provided water. It provided a route for trade and transportation. The port at Ostia, at its mouth, was one of the busiest commercial harbours in the Mediterranean world, and the river itself was the artery through which goods flowed into the city. Grain from Egypt and North Africa, marble from quarries across the empire, timber from the forests of the provinces, wine and oil from across the Mediterranean world, all of it moving up the river toward Rome on boats and barges, or being unloaded at the river docks and carried inland by hand. The work of the river was constant and physically brutal. Longshoremen unloaded cargo from ships and barges, moving heavy goods by hand, by shoulder, by the brute application of human muscle. The weights involved were not trivial. Amphorae, the large ceramic containers used to transport wine, oil and grain, were heavy objects. A full amphora of wine might weigh 30 kilograms or more. Moving hundreds of these in a working day, up gangplanks, across docks, into warehouses, was work that destroyed the body over time in ways that were cumulative and irreversible. The docks were also dangerous in the more immediate sense. The Tiber was not a gentle river. It flooded regularly and dramatically. The low-lying areas along its banks, where the docks and warehouses were concentrated, were among the most flood-prone parts of the city. Workers caught on the docks during a flood event faced drowning. Workers caught in warehouses during floods faced the collapse of structures that were not designed to withstand the hydrostatic pressure of rising water. The river itself was a hazard. The Tiber carried the waste of 1 million people downstream, and the men who worked on and in it were constantly exposed to water that was, by any modern assessment, deeply contaminated. Cuts and abrasions acquired during dock work, which were inevitable given the nature of the labour, became infected with organisms that thrived in that water. Gastrointestinal illness from incidental ingestion of river water was a constant background condition of life for people who worked the docks. And yet the docks never stopped, because the city never stopped eating, never stopped building, never stopped consuming the goods that flowed up the river from the wider world. The workers who made that flow possible were as essential to Rome as the aqueducts or the roads, and almost as invisible to the historical record. Let's talk about the Subura. If Rome had a neighbourhood that embodied everything the city's official image tried to conceal, it was this district, located just northeast of the Roman Forum, pressed between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, close enough to the centre of imperial power that you could walk there in minutes, far enough in character from the marble corridors of the Senate that it might as well have been a different world. The Subura was where the city's working poor lived in the densest concentrations. The insulae here were among the tallest and most precarious in the city. The streets were narrow enough that neighbours in facing buildings could conduct conversations or arguments without raising their voices significantly. The ground floors were occupied by the small businesses that served the working population: bakers, barbers, cobblers, smiths, tavern keepers, and the various other enterprises that a dense urban population requires in constant supply. The Subura had a reputation. Ancient writers used it as a shorthand for everything that was dangerous, disreputable, and morally complicated about urban life. Juvenal wrote about it. Martial wrote about it. Julius Caesar, famously, grew up there in his early years, a biographical detail that historians sometimes use to explain his later comfort with chaos and his instinctive understanding of how the city's lower social strata actually function. But beneath the literary reputation, the Subura was simply where people who had no other options lived and worked. The jobs available in a neighbourhood like this were the jobs that the rest of the city needed done but preferred not to think about. The tanners, for example. Leather was essential to Roman life. Soldiers needed it for armour, sandals, belts, straps. Horses needed harnesses. Ships needed rigging components. The civilian population needed shoes and belts and bags and 100 other things made from cured animal hide. Someone had to produce all of that leather, and the process of producing it was one of the most unpleasant industrial processes in the ancient world. Tanning required soaking animal hides in solutions that would break down the organic material and preserve the hide in a usable form. The traditional Roman tanning solutions included urine, which was collected from public urinals throughout the city, a practice that was common enough that there was actually a tax on collected urine at certain periods. They also included various plant-based tannins and, in some processes, animal brains and feces. The chemistry was empirical, developed through generations of practice, and it worked. but it produced an environment of extraordinary sensory assault. Tanneries were required by Roman law to be located outside the city walls or in specific areas away from the more desirable neighborhoods, because the smell was simply incompatible with proximity to people who had the social power to complain about it. The workers in tanneries spent their days immersed, sometimes literally, in these solutions, handling raw hides, managing the vats, moving material through the various stages of the process. The chemical exposure was constant. The organic material they worked with harbored pathogens. The physical work was heavy and relentless. The fullers, the workers who processed and cleaned woolen cloth, occupied a similar social position. Fulling required treading cloth in vats of liquid to clean and thicken it, and the traditional liquid used was, again, urine, collected and fermented to increase its ammonia content. The fuller spent his working day standing in vats of this material, treading the cloth with his feet and legs. The ammonia was a respiratory irritant. The physical work was exhausting, and the social status of the work was reflected in the location of fulleries, which were, like tanneries, kept at a certain distance from the neighborhoods where people with choices preferred to live. And yet the fullers were also, in their way, a significant economic force. Pompeii's archaeological record shows fulleries that were substantial commercial operations, not small backyard enterprises, but organized businesses with multiple vats and significant throughput. The Guild of Fullers in Pompeii was politically active enough to leave electoral endorsements painted on walls, which tells us that even workers in deeply unglamorous trades had a collective identity and a degree of civic engagement. This is one of the more interesting complications in the story of dangerous Roman work. The people who did the worst jobs were not simply passive victims of their circumstances. They formed associations, collegia, that provided mutual support, burial funds, social connection, a degree of collective identity in a society that otherwise offered them very little recognition. The burial collegium was particularly significant. One of the real anxieties of the Roman poor was the prospect of dying without the resources for a proper burial, which in Roman religious understanding was not merely a social concern, but a spiritual one. An unburied or improperly buried person could not complete the transition to the afterlife. The collegium provided its members with the assurance that when they died, they would be buried properly, regardless of how little they had accumulated in life. This is what solidarity looks like when it emerges from the very bottom of a social hierarchy. Not grand political movements, not eloquent philosophical arguments about human dignity, just the quiet, practical arrangement that says, when you die, we will bury you. Because we know that nobody else will. Let's return to the streets. Let's return to the night. Because the night in Rome was its own particular world, and the people who worked in it were navigating a different set of dangers from those who worked in the mines or the sewers or the arena. After sunset, the character of the city changed. The respectable daytime city, the one of merchants and officials and philosophers and shoppers, retreated indoors. The streets did not empty, but they emptied of a particular kind of person and filled with others. Tavern keepers lit their lamps and opened their doors to the night trade. The popinae, the cheap eating and drinking establishments scattered through the working-class neighborhoods, became the centers of social life for those who had nowhere better to be. The popinae served food that was simple and cheap, bread and olives and lentils and whatever stew was simmering in the large pots that sat over the built-in braziers of the tavern counter. They served wine that was cheap in a different sense, watered down, sometimes adulterated with things that were not wine, sometimes stored in containers that had previously held other things and retained some of their character. The Roman tavern wine was not something you ordered for its quality. You ordered it because it was what was available, and because the alternative was drinking water from the city's water supply, which had its own complicated relationship with human health. The popinae were also gambling establishments in practice, if not always in theory. Dice games were a constant feature of Roman tavern life. Roman law technically restricted gambling to certain periods and contexts, but enforcement was inconsistent enough that gambling happened essentially everywhere and at all hours. The dice were small, made of bone or ivory, and the games were simple enough to be played in the dim light of an oil lamp by people who might be several cups of wine into the evening. The atmosphere could shift quickly. A tavern that was peaceful at the beginning of the evening could become something else entirely by midnight. Alcohol, gambling, the particular social mix of soldiers, laborers, criminals, and the various other categories of people who occupied Rome's night world. These were ingredients that combined unpredictably. Arguments escalated. Fights started over dice results or unpaid debts or old grievances that the wine had loosened from wherever they were stored. The people who worked in these establishments, the tavern keepers, the servers, the cooks, were navigating this environment every night. They were managing customers who were intoxicated, sometimes belligerent, sometimes violent, in spaces that were small and crowded and not easily exited. The tavern keeper who survived a long career in the popinae of the Subura had developed a particular set of skills, the ability to read a room, to de-escalate a situation before it became dangerous, to know when to call for help and when to simply let something run its course. The night watch, the vigiles, patrolled these neighborhoods, but their presence was not a guarantee of safety. They were few in number relative to the size of the city. They had their own priorities and their own relationships with the various informal power structures of the night streets. A vigile patrol passing a tavern where a fight was developing might intervene or might simply continue walking, depending on factors that had more to do with local politics and personal relationships than with any formal system of law enforcement. And then there were the people who made their living from the darkness itself, the thieves, the pickpockets, the confidence men, the various categories of criminal enterprise that flourished in a city with limited street lighting, limited law enforcement, and a large population of people who had money to lose. Roman pickpocketing was a skilled trade in the most literal sense. The crowds that gathered at public games, at markets, at religious festivals, at the various public spectacles that were a regular feature of Roman urban life, these crowds provided ideal working conditions for people whose skill was the removal of valuables from other people's persons without their awareness. The technique required practice, coordination, and a certain kind of social intelligence, the ability to read a crowd, to identify targets, to create or exploit moments of distraction. Ancient writers describe the pickpockets of Rome with a mixture of complaint and reluctant admiration. Martial wrote about thieves so skilled that the victim only realized what had happened hours later. This kind of skill is not innate. It is developed through practice, through the accumulation of experience in the actual working environment, through the kind of apprenticeship that criminal trades have always maintained alongside legitimate ones. The risk was significant. Roman law treated theft seriously, and the penalties for being caught could be severe. But the alternative for many of the people who worked these trades was not a legitimate job that paid a living wage. The alternative was the kind of grinding poverty that made crime, with all its risks, a rational calculation. The underground economy of Rome was not separate from the legitimate economy. It was continuous with it, fed by the same conditions of inequality and scarcity, employing people who might have worked legitimate jobs if legitimate jobs had been available to them on terms that allowed survival. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The dangerous jobs of Rome were not all dangerous in the same way. Some were dangerous because of physical conditions, the gas in the mine, the collapsing tunnel, the fire in the insula. Some were dangerous because of social conditions, the violence of the tavern, the risks of the night street, the legal consequences of the criminal trade. But underneath all of them was a common structure, the structure of a society that needed certain things done and had arranged itself so that the people who did those things had very few alternatives and very little protection. The empire ran on this arrangement. The marble monuments were built on it. The grain that fed 1 million people was processed by it. The leather that equipped the legions was produced through it. The roads that connected the empire were laid by it. The sewers that kept the city from drowning in its own waste were maintained by it. And history, for the most part, looked away. But there are places where the record breaks open and allows us a glimpse of the individual inside the category. Pompeii is one of those places, and not only because of its extraordinary physical preservation. The walls of Pompeii are covered with writing, graffiti in the most literal sense, words scratched or painted onto surfaces by the people who lived and worked there. These are not official inscriptions. They are not the words of emperors or senators or philosophers. They are the words of bakers and tavern keepers and fullers and gladiators and the various other people who occupied the lower registers of Roman social life. Some of this writing is mundane. Prices, names, dates. Some of it is electoral endorsements. The fullers supporting a particular candidate for a local office. Some of it is personal, declarations of love, insults directed at specific individuals, complaints about neighbours, the kind of writing that people do when they want to leave a mark on the world without any expectation that anyone important will read it. And some of it is deeply human in a way that reaches across 2,000 years with unexpected force. There is a gladiator's graffito that records a victory. There is a baker's mark on a loaf of bread, a stamp that identified the bakery of origin, a kind of signature on an object produced for anonymous consumption. There is the name of a slave scratched into a wall in a way that suggests an act of self-assertion, a refusal to be entirely invisible. These fragments are the closest we can get to the actual people behind the dangerous jobs, not the statistics of mortality, not the general conditions of the work, the individual human being who lived inside those conditions and found, in whatever small way was available, a way to say, "I was here." There is one more category of dangerous work that deserves attention, before we begin to settle toward the end of tonight's exploration, and it is one that is rarely discussed in the same breath as gladiators or miners or sewer workers, perhaps because it does not fit neatly into the categories of physical danger that we most readily recognize. The slaves who worked in the households of wealthy Romans occupied a position of extraordinary vulnerability that was not primarily about physical danger in the obvious sense, though that danger was also present. It was about the total absence of legal personhood, the complete dependence on the will of an owner who had, under Roman law, essentially unlimited power over the bodies and lives of the people they owned. Roman slavery was not monolithic. The experience of a highly educated Greek slave who served as a tutor or secretary in an aristocratic household was different in material terms from the experience of a slave working in the mines of Spain. But the underlying condition, the absolute legal subordination of one person to another, the absence of any institutional protection against the arbitrary exercise of that power, was common to both. Household slaves who displeased their owners could be beaten. They could be sold, which meant separation from whatever relationships, however informal, they had formed. They could be punished in ways that the law did not prohibit, and that the social culture of Rome did not particularly condemn. The slave who worked in a wealthy Roman household was surrounded by luxury and comfort that was entirely inaccessible to them, serving people whose lives were defined by the labor of people who had no choice about providing it. And yet, even within this system, the human capacity for adaptation and meaning-making asserted itself. Slaves formed relationships. They had children, though those children were legally the property of the owner. They participated in religious life. They maintained cultural identities. They found ways to exercise whatever small degrees of agency were available within the constraints of their situation. The record of Roman slavery is largely the record of the institution as seen from above, from the perspective of the owners and the law. The inner life of the enslaved is largely lost to us, recoverable only in fragments and inferences. But those fragments matter. They are part of the archive too, the part that was most deliberately suppressed, most systematically erased, and that therefore requires the most careful attention to recover. As we come toward the end of tonight's journey through the archive, it is worth pausing to consider what all of this tells us about the nature of civilization itself. Not just Roman civilization, but the broader pattern that Rome exemplifies so clearly. Every civilization that history has called great has been built on the labor of people whose names it did not record. The monuments that survive are the monuments to power, to wealth, to the people who had the resources to commission stone and marble and the time to think about legacy. The people who quarried the stone, who carried it, who placed it, who maintained the infrastructure that made the whole enterprise possible. They survive only in the aggregate, in the fact of what they built, in the occasional fragment that escaped the general erasure. This is not a uniquely Roman failure. It is a structural feature of how human societies have generally organized themselves and how they have generally organized their memories. The archive of history is not a neutral record. It is a selection made by the people who controlled the means of recording in favor of the things they considered worth recording. Power, by its nature, tends to record itself and to neglect what it depends on. The Sleepless archive exists, in part, to read what was left out, to follow the narrow streets away from the forum and into the neighbourhoods where most people actually lived, to descend into the tunnels where the essential work happened in the dark, to stand at the edge of the quarry and consider the human cost of the stone, to sit for a moment in the heat of the bakery and think about the person who spent their life there, producing the bread that kept the city alive. There is something both melancholy and quietly inspiring about this kind of attention. Melancholy because so much has been lost. So many names, so many stories, so many individual lives that deserved to be remembered and were not. Inspiring because the attention itself is a form of recovery. Because the act of asking who actually did this work, what was their life like, what did they endure, is a way of insisting that they matter, even now, even across the distance of 2,000 years. The man who maintained the Cloaca Maxima does not have a marble statue. He does not have an inscription. He does not have a name in the historical record. But the sewer he maintained is still there, in some form, beneath the city that grew up over Roman Rome. His work persists. The city he made habitable persists. The civilization that depended on his labor persists, in its monuments and its roads and its legal traditions and its languages. He is in all of it, unnamed and unacknowledged. And perhaps that is the thing worth sitting with as the night deepens around you and the day's noise falls further away. The archive does not only contain the records that were kept, it also contains the shape of what was left out. The silences in the record are themselves a kind of document. They tell us what a society chose not to see, what it needed to not see in order to maintain its self-image as the center of civilization, the pinnacle of human achievement, the empire that would last forever. Rome did not last forever. No empire does. The insula eventually fell. The mines were eventually abandoned. The arena fell silent. The roads crumbled in the places where no one maintained them. The city that had been 1 million people shrank over centuries to a fraction of that, and the neighborhoods that had been so dangerously, chaotically, vitally alive became ruins. Then archaeological sites, then tourist destinations where people walk carefully over ancient stones and try to imagine what it was like. What it was like was loud and crowded and dangerous and full of people doing work that nobody wanted to think about, in conditions that nobody wanted to acknowledge, for compensation that barely sustained life. And those people, for the most part, got up every morning and did the work anyway, because the alternative was worse, and because the city needed them, and because the human capacity for endurance is one of the most extraordinary things in the historical record, even when the record itself refuses to acknowledge it. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia that we have explored in other nights in this archive remember the names of kings and the records of harvests and the prayers of priests. The marble inscriptions of Rome remember the victories of generals and the benefactions of wealthy citizens and the decrees of emperors. These are the things that history chose to preserve. But beneath the inscriptions, beneath the marble, beneath the monuments, there is another archive. The archive of the body. The healed fractures in the gladiator's bones, the silica-scarred lungs of the quarry worker, the calluses on the hands of the dock worker, the burns on the arms of the baker. These are inscriptions too, written in flesh and bone, rather than stone, and they tell a history that is in some ways more honest than the official record, because the body does not lie about what it has endured. We are inheritors of that endurance. The roads we can still trace across the European landscape were built by people who did not choose to build them. The aqueducts that still stand in southern France and Spain were maintained by people whose names we will never know. The grain that fed Rome was processed by people who worked in conditions that shortened their lives. The leather that equipped the legions was produced by people who spent their days in the smell and the chemical exposure of the tannery. All of this is part of the inheritance, the beautiful and the brutal together, the monument and the mine together, the triumph and the sewer together. History is not a single story. It is an archive of competing stories, most of which were never given the resources to preserve themselves. The work of the Sleepless archive in the quiet hours of the night is to open the files that were set aside, to read the documents that were never meant to be the official record, to follow the narrow streets away from the forum and into the places where most of the story actually happened. Tonight, we followed those streets into the mines and the sewers, into the arena and the bakery, into the tannery and the dock, into the tavern and the night street. We spent time with the people who kept the empire running while the empire pretended not to notice them. Their names are gone. Their faces are gone. But the work they did is still there, in the infrastructure that outlasted the civilization that built it, in the roads and the drains and the aqueducts and the walls. They are present in the aggregate of what they made, even if they are absent from the record of who made it. And as the night settles deeper around you, as the sounds of the day fade further into the distance, perhaps there is something quietly comforting in that thought, that the work we do persists beyond the record of it, that the things we make and maintain and keep running outlast the acknowledgement of our role in making them, that the archive of what was actually done is larger and more honest and more enduring than the archive of what was officially recorded. If this video found you in a quiet moment, consider sending it to someone who also wanders through history looking for what was left out. Every time one of these hidden files reaches a new pair of eyes, it creates a small ripple. Another person asking who actually built this, who actually carried that stone, who actually kept the city alive. That kind of curiosity, passed from one person to another across time zones and sleepless nights, is its own form of preservation. It is how forgotten things get remembered, and it would mean something to listen to this again on a night when sleep refuses to come. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently each time. The clay remembers what the inscription forgot. The stone carries the mark of the hand that shaped it. The road still runs in the direction it was laid, by someone whose name the road does not know. And somewhere beneath the modern city of Rome, the great drain still runs, still carrying water toward the Tiber, still doing the work it was built to do 2,500 years ago, by people who had no choice about the work and who did it anyway, in the dark, in the heat, in the smell, in the silence that history eventually settled over everything they were. That silence is what we have been reading tonight, and it is, in its own way, as eloquent as anything the marble ever said. Rest now, let the archive close for this evening. The files will be here when you return. The hidden history of the people who kept civilization running is patient. It has been waiting 2,000 years for someone to look carefully enough to find it. It can wait a little longer. Until next time, may your path through history's deepest mysteries be illuminated by curiosity. And may the silence between the records speak as clearly to you as the records themselves. The archive remains open. The night shift continues. And somewhere in the dark, the work goes on. The archive has another file open, one that sits very close to tonight's questions. Roman inventions that were hidden from us follows the same thread we pulled tonight. The gap between what Rome claimed to be and what it actually built, and what it quietly buried when the invention became inconvenient. That file is waiting whenever you are ready.